Introduce Gerardo Ceballos. He's working at UNAM in Mexico City, and we've known each other for several years. He's a good friend, and does some really fascinating work, both on the ground, chasing down jaguars in Mexico and radio tracking them and implementing conservation strategies for prairie dogs in northern Mexico, as well as working at the very broad scale, doing conservation planning. We're really sort of bridging from field zoologist, naturalist, all the way to macroecology and broad-scale conservation. And looking forward to this presentation.
Thanks. Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much. I'm going to talk today about this global patterns of mammal distribution from local. And from local, I'm going to give you just one example of what we do in Mexico, and then to global scales. And I would like to be aware. I like to make you aware that most of these global projects looking at the global level, where animals or mammals or birds are, and have enormous problems on trying to go down to the regional or national level. But on the other hand, are very important to give us a big, broad view of what are the important steps towards achieving conservation at these levels. Well, first of all, I'm very grateful to Walter to invite me to talk here with you, and for you for attending this meeting. This is one of the last universities I have never been invited to speak of, and I was very angry about it. Not anymore. Well, thank you very, very much. And as we all know, the global environmental problems, when I studied biology not many years ago, well, something like 25 years ago, there was only one really global environmental problem. That was the depletion of the ozone layer. Now, every 2-3 weeks, every month, we hear about a completely new, unforeseen global problem, environmental problem. So we're really facing what I think is a unique time in the history of humanity, where both economic and environmental collapses are pushing us towards very, very unknown territory. And I think about all of this, the most important one is the loss of biological biodiversity. And in Mexico, this is a very severe problem. And what I'm going to tell you today is how I went from very specific issues then to global patterns, and then very quickly I'm going to tell you what we are doing now in Mexico to try to convert all this scientific knowledge into public policy. Basically, what it motivates me, what it motivates my work in real life is trying to save as much species of plants as animals as I can. Once somebody asked me why I have such a weird thing in mind. I don't know, but this is what I wanted to do, and this is what I have focused all my research and all my applications, you know. We have heard here that resources for conservation are very limited, and part of the problem, I think, is us as biologists, ecologists, that we haven't been able to explain properly to politicians, to people taking decisions, why it's important to put more money into conservation, regardless of saving the species of the plants, of the animals, but in terms of human well-being. And obviously, doing that will give us a proper framework to save all the species that we need to save. And mammals, well, I think, let me see. Okay. I compiled the first distribution map of all the mammals of the world in 2005. It was this before IUCN, and what we did is address several important questions. And basically, one of the most interesting ones was, for the first time, at least to my knowledge, we were able to synthesize in 2005, what were the patterns of species distributions of all the mammals of the world, of any large taxon like that. And I'm an expert on mammals. And what I saw here on those maps was something that I couldn't even imagine that was happening. First, there was a species richness. Mexico, very important in terms of species richness, but some areas like here in the Himalayas that didn't have a slightly idea that were important and have those species. Then species at the risk of extinction, very interesting patterns. And then this is very, very important, endemic species, what we call politically endemic species restricted to one country. It's more than 2,000 species are restricted to just a single country, you know. And this started to make me think that having this large amount of information synthesized could really be a major step to understanding these big patterns and also to use them for foster conservation. For instance, that particular graph, these two graphs, has been extremely important in Mexico to increase the budget for protected areas, for instance, for $1 million per year to more than $150 million a year through the government. And I'm happy to tell you that the new administration in Mexico, we are going to work closely together, and we're trying to expand the protected areas to almost 25% of the whole territory. And this is a compromise we have with the new president, plus increasing probably to almost $1 billion the amount of money to spend in protecting the areas. But protecting the areas doesn't mean that we're going to fence them out. It's working with the local people to empower them and to use them so they get benefit from conservation. So anyway, working at the global level, what I realized it was a lot of species were restricted to very, very small ranges, making them very prone to extinction. And then, as you can see in some of my slides, you will see a species, and then the name, and then a country and the year. And these are all species new to science. Since 2000 and more or less 10 years ago, more than 600 species of new mammals has been discovered. And I'm not talking about a split of a species like the African elephant that is considered two species. I'm talking about completely new things, like this white monkey in Brazil, this animal, this a whole new family of mammal discovered in a market in Laos. There was a mammal he was looking at, he found it, bought it, and then he discovered it was a whole new species, and so on. So basically what we have found is there is lots of new species of mammals. If we put the splits and so on, and all this taxonomic variation, there are more than 1,500 species who has been described or split in the last 10 years. If this is happening to mammals, just imagine what is happening to all lower or more inconspicuous animals. So what Eric was saying, that is probably 10 million species of large animals. I don't think we have really a close, good idea of how many species there are. But what we know is that the largest number, the largest percentage of species on Earth are undescribed. And most of them, as I'm going to show you in a minute, are found in places who are highly impacted or are disappearing really, really fast. So what we have done before, after we discovered this species, we did some predictive work on trying to assess where the new species of mammals and the new species of amphibians could be found. And we found things like that, you know, like areas like here in Los Andes or in the Himalayas, in Papua New Guinea, and so on. So in 2011, I went to one of these particular places that was highlighted in my study as a very promising. And guess what? What we found is 8 new species of mammals. Of those 8 new species of mammals, some of them were rather remarkable, like this new monkey, this new porcupine. This is the 4th species of the shrew marsupial in South America. And we found the southernmost record of a new species of shrew also in Los Andes. For me, this was rather remarkable for 3 things. First, we have predicted those areas as important for probably fostering new species of mammals and amphibians. We went to those areas and we found those species. And the field work, it took us only 15 days. We're going back this year, and we're going to a new area in where we think we're going to find more species. The second, these species are found in a place, in a paper park, who was set aside in Peru in 1986. For some reason, in 1986, somebody has a great idea to protect that area. It was protected. Now, although it's very isolated, it's surrounded by crops, and those species live exclusively in that area. If that person, and I say this because there is a lot of criticism between scientists saying that sometimes we set aside parts without not knowing what is there in full detail. Obviously, this person, the person who set aside this area, he understood that the heterogeneity, the isolation, and so on could be important for the species that could harbor, and he was right. And the third is all these species, because of the tiny range they have, should be considered in danger of extinction. And if we could have gone to this area probably in a few years' time without surveying it now, they could probably have become extinct without even being known to science. And this is what's happening all over the world. Tons of species are becoming extinct, but we don't know just simply because there are not enough scientists describing them. So what we have been doing then in my lab at this level is looking at then what are the global patterns of species distributions and so on. And then we have decided now to work on what could be some interesting new approaches on addressing some of these large-scale patterns, and what can we learn about what species are being lost, aside from the number of species. So we have been starting to work at this global level with what we call the functional ecology, functional traits. And that means that we're looking not only what species are becoming extinct, but what are the traits, what is the ecological role of some of those species in the places. Because this is telling us not only what species is lost, but also what functions are we losing in the environment. And we are linking those functions with what we call environmental services, that are all those benefits that we get for free from nature. So this is extremely important because nature services or environmental services has been a key issue for fostering conservation in Mexico. When I talk to the Minister of the Environment or the Minister of the Economy and so on about conservation, I hardly say preserving a species or maintaining a species or biodiversity. I most of the time first explain why all these species are required to keep the well-being, human well-being in the country. Why are they important to maintain productivity? Why they are important to face global warming in terms of food production? And then we can easily relate to why we should keep those species going. And it has been extremely useful for me to be able to use that kind of thing. Now, looking at this, and I'm not going to go into detail, but it's basically, this is a global distribution of habitat richness across ecoregions in the world, and we're having here terrestrial mammals, aquatic, arboreal, woodland, fossorial, and so on. We have a big database on that. And the information that we're getting from that is very, very promising, very, very interesting. This is one example at the global level, and this is a paper that's going to be published in PNAS. And then this is something in a little bit more detail, looking at the same patterns in Africa, you know. So, looking at those big patterns has allowed me three things specifically. One is to understand where the distribution of species are, and trying to link it to more the environmental issues, like what are the determinants in terms of temperature or precipitation and so on. What is the relationship of those distributions to, for instance, human impacts? And third, to try to have a glimpse, an idea of what could be the areas important for conservation. And here I will also warn again that this is simply a way to visualize it. In this particular case, what we did in our paper in 2005 was that we asked this question: what we need to preserve 10% of all the geographic ranges of the mammals of the world? And what we found is like having that goal will demand a huge area, roughly 4.3% of the ice-free land surface of the Earth. And this is extremely, extremely important. This is just mammals. Imagine if we need to put on top birds, reptiles, amphibians, butterflies, water fishes, freshwater, whatever. It means that practically all Earth, all the surface of Earth should be protected to save all the species. Obviously, that's impossible. Yeah? What we find here also is something that is extremely important. In 2002, I published a paper in which we say that a species extinction is extremely bad, but populations extinction is terrible, because if we have jaguars, for instance, in Mexico, and we lost jaguars in Mexico, it doesn't matter that we have the species in Brazil, because the role that the species is playing in the regional in Mexico is lost. And we're losing so many of those species. So in this particular case, for instance, what we find out that in each one of these 10,000 square kilometer cells, if we consider each representation of a mammal in an area like that as a population, what we're looking at here is we will be protecting here more than 100,000 populations of mammals. So what we look then is what percentage of those cells that are required to protect the 10% of the mammals were already impacted by human activities. And it is really, really interesting, because what we find that 80% of the land area that is required to protect those species has to be managed in order it's already been managed, and it has been impacted by agriculture. 80% of the cells that are important to protect the 10% of the mammals are already impacted by agriculture. Yeah? And at least 20% of the cells who were critical for conservation of mammals were mostly gone by agriculture. And let me remind you that we are now 7 billion people, and probably the future of biodiversity will depend on a couple of things: on energy, on the fate of food production. And we have seen already that this is a huge problem already, and this will become even worse. So we need to find out ways to couple development and conservation, and these kind of tools are helping us a lot. Then we have a push our studies towards the marine things, and we did the same analysis of the marine mammals, and we came out with this information in which we call the priority sites for conservation of the marine mammals, and we found basically these areas are extremely important. The Japanese, the New Zealand, South African, and so on are important because of their species richness. They are tremendous important because they harbor a lot of the mammal species, marine mammal species of the world. And then what we have here is places that we call it replaceable, and these places have a species found nowhere else. So in this particular case, this can be important guidance for focusing conservation. And when we published this paper, I got a letter from the Minister of the Environment from Russia, the one on Peru, and the one from New Zealand, requesting more information because they were very interested, because of this paper, on having some public policy affecting conservation on this particular area. For instance, the Russians were extremely keen to see the Baikal area was important because of its an endemic seal over there, the only freshwater seal on the world. And then with one of my colleagues, like Anna Davidson here, we have been working on trying to predict and trying to see what are the traits that make a species more prone to extinction. And one thing that a paper that hasn't caught up yet properly, but I want going to push it a little bit more, is that with Anna, what we found is like a set of rules of thumb or gold in which we can know now, we can tell you what size. Everybody says that size is a predictor of extinction in mammals. We can tell you now very precisely at what level, what weight it makes a species more prone to extinction. And we can also tell you with a lot of detail what arboreal species are more prone to extinction, to fossorial species, and so on. And we have done this for terrestrial mammals, and we have done this for marine mammals of the world. And what we have found is like these very, very interesting patterns. So what are the most important things affecting the extinction risk, like body mass, like taxonomic groups and so on. But also what we have found is that there are several species of mammals, of marine mammals, that right now are not considering extinct or threatened or vulnerable, but that they have all the characteristics required by to be considered like that. And they are probably not being considered on being endangered with extinction simply because there is not enough information available. So this is a kind of predictive analysis. And then I did this with Walter yet. And basically with Walter we have done is like what species or what groups could be used as surrogates. And just to give you this very briefly, is bats and rodents explain 72% of the mammal species of the world. If you know what are the mammals, you know what are the rodents, for instance, or the bats and area, you can know perfectly well what are the other species, and you can play around with these kind of things. Well, this is some of the concluding remarks I have on the broader, larger scale thing, and then what I'm going to spend the last 2 minutes here is to let you know what I think are three most important things I have learned with these studies. First, this taking advantage of this large database and the powerful computing and analysis methods that we have now is extremely powerful to understand issues that otherwise are basically impossible to understand. Second, that looking at the global level is important to give you guidelines, but it's almost, it will be useless or impractical to go from the global level to a country level. To go to a country level, you have to work with much more detailed data on that level, you know. Third, I don't like the idea of prioritizing species and saying that we're going to save this species or save this species, or that we're putting a lot of money in the panda. It should, the conservation in the real world doesn't work that way. The money has been allocated to California condor, for instance. That there is a lot of criticism that this money should have been gone to somewhere else. If that money shouldn't have been put into the California condor, it would probably have been put in a highway somewhere in the country. So I think the prioritization goes in a different way. The prioritization should go an understanding at a more country level issue. What are the important critical factors affecting species, and then try to link those to, on the one thing, public policy. How do we convert our science into public policy? And second, to make the link with conservation and development, because in Mexico, the best, the most important, the long-term conservation issues that we have been able to address are the ones where we have been able to take one group of species or one problem, link it to development, and then producing a solution that on the one hand will keep the system going, the environmental system going, the plant and the animals and the ecosystem, and on the other hand will provide solutions for the local people, for benefiting the local people, and for the regional and the national economy. And I think these are one of the critical issues that we have to address here. And thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Gerardo. Should be breaking for coffee soon, but one or two questions, perhaps?
Well, just to finish then, let me tell you that we have been able in Mexico, I do basic science, but we have been able to do a really quantum leap in conservation, because since the last 20 years we have an Endangered Species Act, we have a new, the National System of Protected Areas, we have specific goals, and with this new government, we have created a social movement. It's called Mexico, the Environmental Revolution, that is pushing forward to have a specific objective like zero deforestation rates in protected areas at the end of this sixth term year. We're looking at what are the problems causing deforestation, and then we're looking at the specific solution that the government, national government, can do and turn into public policy. And I think linking conservation, linking basic science with conservation, and then with important coupling it with development is one of the most promising ways to try to stop the massacre what we're doing with species extinction. And just to finish, let me tell you that we just have probably what I think is the most important, the most conservative but also solid analysis of the extinction rates on vertebrates. And the data shows that we're losing species at the rate probably between 20 to 120 times faster than the background rate. And this means that the species that we have lost in the last 100 years should have been lost naturally between 1,000 to 15,000 years. That's the magnitude of this terrible crisis of extinction of species. Thank you.